how important it is that we be faithful in our stewardship of the resources that God entrusts to us. It is right to be honest and transparent. That's God's expectation of us as stewards. And as Paul says, we want to avoid criticism of our stewardship because the church is watching and the unbelieving world is watching to see if we're faithful. And our hope is that this morning will help us all better to fulfill this calling. Well, let me introduce the members of our panel who will be making presentations today. Lynn Milograno, wave Lynn. Lynn Milograno is our amazing diocesan administrator for the past 10 years, and Lynn is a former CPA. Gary French. Gary French is a professional economist, former church administrator, and Gary has served as the DOMA Treasurer for all 10 years of the life of our diocese. Jim Oakes. Jim is past senior warden of Truro, member of Truro's Finance Committee. He's also the former chair and former acting executive director of Five Talents, the International Anglican Microfinance Ministry. And Jim currently serves on the Diocesan Standing Committee and the Diocesan Finance Committee. Phil Rooney. Phil is a retired Navy officer with a Harvard MBA. He is treasurer of Church of the Apostles in Fairfax, a position he has held since 2003. Also with us to help us with questions that you might have today are Mary Beth Moore, who is the DOMA bookkeeper, and Heather Adams, who is our DOMA registrar, and Heidi Reichert, who's our DOMA communications coordinator. So let me turn it over now to Lynn Milograno, who will be facilitating our time together. Lynn?
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm so glad you could be with us today. So our goals for today's training are threefold. We want to review the basic principles of sound financial management. We want to provide you with resources that we believe you'll find useful in your role in financial management at your church. And we want to introduce you to a number of people who are willing and available to help with any questions you might have both now and in the future. So before we start, I'd like to briefly go over some meeting management items and then we'll jump right in. This training is being recorded and will be available on our website, www.anglicandoma.org. Please be sure you are muted when you are not speaking. We will be having breaks every hour, but feel free to turn off your screen anytime if you need to step away. We understand about Zoom fatigue, believe me. If you have technical questions or problems during this presentation, Heidi Reichert is here in the office and available to help you. You can reach her at our office number. I believe she put that on the screen, but 703-590-5470 if you're having any problems. Now, our presentations are not meant to be legal advice. And on any such topic, I would encourage you to get in touch with your church's legal representative for counsel. We have built in some time during the morning for Q&A because we feel it's important that we're addressing topics that are helpful for you. So please feel free to post a question in the chat box at any time during the presentations. Direct your questions to everyone, please, rather than a single individual, and we will address them at the end of each hour. Now, with that, we're going to turn to DOMA's longtime treasurer and friend, who's going to give us an overview of the roles of the church treasurer and the finance committee. Gary? Gary, are you muted?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
I'm sorry. Hi, I'm happy to be here today. I'm going to have remarks about the role of the treasurer and the finance committee of a church. and especially with regard to the interaction of the Treasurer and the Finance Committee to the vestry, to the church's banks, to the bookkeeper and accounting and bookkeeping matters, related to the financial statements and the budget and other matters. So I'll just jump right in with that. In general, the Treasurer and the Finance Committee are responsible, of course, for the financial affairs of the church. However, they have that responsibility as delegated from the vestry. The treasurer may be an individual may be recommended by the rector or someone else to be the treasurer of a church, but the vestry must appoint the treasurer, and the treasurer is accountable to the vestry, not directly to the rector, although he may well interact a lot with the rector. And the treasurer usually attends each regularly scheduled vestry meeting, typically provides a financial report at the meeting, and the treasurer may be a paid employee, but many treasurers are volunteers. I know that I'm a volunteer to be DOMA's treasurer, so it's not it's very common that they're volunteers. The Finance Committee is also established by the vestry, and its members must be approved by the vestry. The treasurer is an ex officio member of the Finance Committee, but he may serve as the chairperson of the Finance Committee. Although at a larger church, that might not be the case, and one of the other members of the committee would be the chairperson. Other members of the committee include other vestry members or just generally members of the congregation that have agreed to serve on the Finance Committee and were approved by the vestry to do so. The treasurer typically manages the church's relationships with its bank or banks, including opening and monitoring checking and savings accounts, and is usually one of the persons that is authorized to sign checks for the church. The treasurer will supervise the bookkeeper or accountant of the church, but the treasurer doesn't keep the books, even though he has to be pretty familiar with accounting and bookkeeping matters. It's the bookkeeper or accountant's responsibility to keep the books. The treasurer will supervise that person, but that person is typically a paid employee, part-time or full-time, of the church, unlike others. The treasurer is also responsible for the financial statements that are made for the church. Typically, accounting software that the bookkeeper uses will generate a monthly or periodic set of financial statements, including an income statement and a balance sheet ordinarily. It might include some other documents from time to time. And these are prepared or generated by the software, and the bookkeeper generally has a role in that. The treasurer certainly must look at them, be familiar with them, and know how to explain them. The treasurer and the Finance Committee also prepare the annual budget for the church. And that means that they put it together. There are other people that might provide input to the Finance Committee in doing so. And that would include the rector, the wardens, a church administrator perhaps, and others, ministry leaders, for example. But the document has to be prepared for the vestry to look at by the treasurer and the finance committee. And the monthly financials as well as the budget are typically explained to the vestry by the treasurer, or in some larger churches, sometimes the chairman of the finance committee. And all of those things are within the domain of the treasurer, and are the regular things that the treasurer looks at and monitors every month on a regular basis. As a consequence of that, the treasurer has to sort of vouch informally anyway for their accuracy. And the treasurer understands that certain accounting and financial controls are put in place that somebody else will talk about more later, but he has to be familiar with them and shares in responsibility for ensuring that they're there and that they're adhered to. The treasurer typically has custody of the bank accounts of the church. And through that custody and through its supervision of the bookkeeper, the treasurer ensures that there's accurate and sure accounting of all offerings, gifts, donations, and any other inflows of cash, and that they're deposited into the church's bank accounts. The treasurer himself doesn't do any of those things, but he oversees those who does, and ultimately has the responsibility that they're doing it properly. The same is true on the expense side or expenditure side of the church. The treasurer ensures that all rent, payroll, and other accounts payable and obligations of the church are met in a timely and efficient manner. And finally, in terms of its cash flow items, the treasurer has a role in any debt the church may choose to incur. And typically, if there's going to be an amount of debt, the vestry would be involved in determining that and approving or directing the treasurer and others to interact with the banks to make a loan or borrow funds on a short-term or long-term basis. In those instances, the treasurer ultimately either prepares the loan application or oversees others preparing the loan application that is submitted to a bank in order to borrow money if the church has a need to do so. And the treasurer also is involved with the annual audit or review, accounting review of the church. The treasurer doesn't do that. An outside entity, for larger churches, that's usually a CPA or a CPA firm, is retained to do an annual audit or review. In smaller churches, sometimes it's just retaining someone from outside the church that has accounting and finance experience and expertise, but may not be a CPA to do a review of the church. And so that's a lot of what the treasurer does. And there's some other matters that he has to be familiar with, though. In order to understand the bookkeeping and how everything is done in the church financially, the treasurer should be aware of the nature and number and types of fringe benefits that employees of the church are entitled to, and the eligibility of those benefits to various employees. Like often full-time employees like the rector are certainly covered by the benefits, but part-time employees may or may not be, depending on the church's policies and means. The bookkeeper also has to be aware of payroll accounting, and especially the special needs of compensating the rector, which involves in part determining the housing allowance, or what portion of the rector's cash compensation is going to be designated as a housing allowance, because under IRS regulations, that portion of the rector's cash income is not taxable. And so that means that every rector wants to have that housing allowance to avoid greater taxes. And probably the final thing that the treasurer is often involved in is insurance for the church. The treasurer has to be aware of the risks to which the church may be exposed, and the types of insurance that the church will need because of those risks. And probably it may well be the one who interacts with insurance companies to acquire and maintain those policies. I think that's about all I have to say directly about the role and responsibilities of the treasurer and the finance committee. But I'll be here during the first Q&A session and will attempt to answer any questions you may have about those.
Great, thank you so much, Gary. That was really good. Next up on our agenda is Jim Oakes, who's going to be telling us 10 things he wishes someone had told him. So I'm looking forward to hearing this one, Jim. So over to you.
Thank you, Lynn, and good morning, everybody. I want to first correct one thing that John said about Lynn. He described her as a former CPA. Now, my son was in the Marine Corps, and I learned that once you're a Marine, you're always a Marine. And I think that same thing is true of CPAs. I think once you're a CPA, you're always a CPA, whether you're still active with your license or not. So just for what that's worth, I'm going to share my screen. And there. I want to start with just a kind of an anecdote. I've heard over the years people say that the secret to success is good judgment. And of course, you ask the question, how do you get good judgment? And you get good judgment from experience, right? And so they want to know, how do you get experience? And you get experience from bad judgment. So my hope is that when we talk about what a treasurer can do, that we can kind of skip the bad judgment step and move on. I first served as a church treasurer at a small Presbyterian church in Atlanta almost 50 years ago. And frankly, I had no idea what I was doing. And when I think back to those days, I kind of shudder for the church, for me, for what I didn't know, for what safeguards the church didn't have, and what could have gone wrong. My hope and prayer is that we can learn from that. And there are some really talented people involved in this discussion today, both the teachers that you'll be hearing from and the learners. There's a lot of wisdom around the diocese, and I hope we can review best practices, rules of the road, and gotchas. And probably most important is know who to go to when you have a question, and that you won't be in the position I was in all those years ago in Atlanta of scratching my head, wondering what I was supposed to do next. So first, to kind of restate something we've talked about a bit, as the treasurer of the church, your primary duty is to protect the integrity of the church's assets and assure that they are used for their intended purpose. And to illustrate that in a little bit different way, I was a junior Air Force officer about 100 years ago. And my first assignment was as a finance officer at an Air Force regional hospital. I learned when I got into that role that in that role as finance officer, I was responsible for the financial accounts of the hospital. And I learned that I was on the hook for the financial integrity of the records, expenditures, fund balances, and so forth, regardless of what my commander might have ordered me to do. Now, I know there are a number of veterans participating in this call today, and I want you to picture with me, me standing up there as a second lieutenant, standing in front of my commander, who was a full colonel, telling him he couldn't do something he wanted to do. It was not a pretty sight, but it was part of the job, frankly. And that same thing is true when you look at the role of a treasurer versus the rector sometimes, or the vestry, or whatever. Now, fortunately, I made it through my time on active duty without getting banged around too much, and I hope you will too in your role as treasurer. But I learned a valuable lesson there. The next thing I want to highlight is that I don't think anybody would question that the climate we're in is growing increasingly hostile to Christianity. And it's more important than ever to make sure that we're squeaky clean in our handling of money, both as a witness and, frankly, as a protection. Frankly, I don't know how anybody could doubt that we're under attack, not just Christian institutions, but virtually every civic institution lives under a cloud of suspicion. And those who don't wish us well come in all shapes and sizes, and some of them can and will use any means to discredit us and our message. And my plea would be, let's not give them the ammunition. And in particular, we need to be as aware of the appearance of impropriety as the actuality of it. There are just way too many horror stories out there. I'm sure we'll hear some of them today, but so far we haven't seen any of those as regards finance hit DOMA that I'm aware of, and let's hope and pray that it remains that way. I think this is a kind of a well-known thing. It's been interesting to me to observe that most clergy that get in trouble get there because of issues related either to sex or money. Now, finally, we're hearing more about mutual protection in the area of sexual misconduct, but we haven't gotten there as much with finances, and we need to move in that direction. Now, unfortunately, we still hear a lot, sadly, about sexual misconduct, and it's all too common. And we've started in recent years to take it a lot more seriously. And we have in the diocese and ACNA and other places training on prevention of sexual misconduct. It's pretty ubiquitous now. And most of us have learned, or we're learning, the guardrails that exist and the things we need to do to keep ourselves safe, both potential victims and potential perpetrators. We need to be just as judicious with finances. And the good news is that the protections and the policies and the practices that are out there work pretty well if we let them. We'll be covering a lot of that today. And there are a lot of resources available, both within the diocese and elsewhere. And again, we'll be talking about that. Lynn has made up a list of resources available, and I know there are a lot more. Let me get to something a little more specific. As churches, as nonprofit institutions, we're exempt from many legal and HR requirements, but we do not have carte blanche exemptions from them. And it's wise to know the difference. And here's a case, I teach part-time, and one of the jokes that you hear around the university is that you don't necessarily have to change the test every year, you just have to change the answers. And it keeps people going. And the answers here change regularly. For example, can we require that all employees be Christian? Can we enforce morals clauses? Now, I used to be pretty confident that I knew the answers to those questions, but I'm not sure I do anymore. And yes, I'm getting older, but the answers do in fact keep changing. And what I would say is it's never wise to assume that common sense is going to give you the right answer. If you don't know, ask. There are people around the diocese that are up to date, up to the minute on the latest regulations and the latest guidelines and the latest gotchas with regard to those questions, and 100 related ones. And what we don't want to do is just get tripped up in some simple issue, or what should be a simple issue. And to be specific about that, and this is a kind of a subset of the prior point, fringe benefits must be granted and administered in an equitable manner in accordance with applicable laws and regulations. There are just a lot of can't do that guardrails that must be followed. The generalization I've generally followed is that you don't have to treat everyone the same, but you do have to treat all employees in the same class the same way, if that makes sense. And a particular caution with fringe benefits, and this happens, is that careless handling can result in benefits being regarded as taxable income to the employee. Fairness isn't always possible, and common sense sometimes can get you in trouble. Examples would be, who do you grant health insurance to? To the employee only, to the employee's spouse, employee and family? What if they don't need it? How about time off without pay, et cetera, et cetera? One issue I've encountered multiple times, and I bet a number of you have as well, is the case of an employee who doesn't need health insurance. Say their spouse is employed by the government or by an employee or employer that offers health insurance. And that's fine, but then they want to take the savings in the form of higher pay. Can you do that? Well, my understanding has always been, no, you can't do that. You've got to treat them the same, whether they accept the benefit or not. And there are people that will say, but that's not fair. And it's true, it's not fair, but that's the way it is. So the lesson I've learned from this, frankly, is to be afraid enough of this that when something comes up in my world, I try to never assume that I know the answer to these questions. I try to go to someone that I know is going to have an authoritative answer. Next, best practices, separation of duties, segregation of counting and recording are for your protection as much as for financial integrity. Clouds of suspicion can form when anything goes wrong, and they can be notoriously hard to dissipate once they do. The best defense for these situations, frankly, isn't I didn't do it, or I'm a good guy, I would never do that sort of thing. The best defense is I couldn't have done it. Now, it's true that best practices won't guarantee that bad things can't happen, but adherence to them will make it much less likely that if something goes wrong, you have a safe harbor that you can use as a defense. I did all the things I should have done. I did all of the things that were recommended to us to do, and therefore we did everything that a reasonable person could have done. That's a great legal defense. It's a great defense to your congregation, and it's just a much safer place to be. One of the few things I'm really adamant about is to never let anybody be alone with cash, including yourself. And that should be kind of self-explanatory. The good news is it's not nearly as big an issue today as it used to be, just because fewer people pay with cash. But the same principles would apply to cash-like assets, an ATM card, for example, that sort of thing. And we still do have situations where we might have people handling large amounts of cash. I've been with Five Talents and other situations. I've been on a number of mission trips, and some of those have included the responsibility for taking large amounts of cash with us. I made one trip to Uganda where I was sort of the group treasurer, and I had a nest egg of like $12,000 that we were going to use to pay for expenses along the way. Because as you can imagine, a lot of restaurants in Western and rural Uganda don't take American Express. So we had a large amount of cash that we had to keep track of. But I had a deal with another member of the team that we counted the cash together every time we took anything out of it. We listed every expenditure, we verified the balances, we made sure that everybody knew what was going on with the cash. Our theory was that sunlight is a great disinfectant, and we didn't want to all of a sudden discover that we were missing some cash and have the clouds of suspicion arise. Our clients in Five Talents, by the way, use those same kinds of disciplines. When they collect cash at a group meeting, they have their members deposit the cash in a cash box in front of everybody. The cash box always has multiple locks on it so that no one person ever has access to it. So there are sophisticated ways and there are simple ways, but there are always ways to make sure that you're protected both from the possibility of theft and from the possibility of being accused of theft, both of which can be really serious. Let's look at benevolence accounts, and we don't call them discretionary funds. They are still subject to accountability and oversight, and handling them incorrectly can result in penalties to the rector and to others. And I would say, yes, people have gone to jail for this, but probably the more likely penalty is that those funds, if not handled properly, can be counted as taxable income to the rector. And I don't know too many rectors who think that would be a good outcome. So despite the fact that they may want more unfettered access to their benevolence accounts, this would be a case where you can think of yourself as the second lieutenant standing in front of the full colonel telling them they can't do what they want to do, because those accountabilities and those guardrails are there for a time or for a reason. There was a time when a rector could have a separate bank account with funds that only they could use. But although somebody might tell me there is some extraordinary circumstances where it might be possible, I would say that time is gone. And if the rector pushes back on this, I would say your role is to remind them that the guardrails are there for their protection as much as anything else. Whether or not your accounts are formally audited, they should be periodically reviewed by an outside expert. It's not just a requirement, it's a good idea. We all have blind spots, and we all fall into the trap of assuming that Joe or Susie or whomever is such a good person that we don't need to worry about what they're doing, and they work so hard that we don't want to make them think we don't trust them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. None of that matters if something goes wrong. Now, it's true, any auditor will tell you that audits won't necessarily detect fraud. That's a true statement. But what's also true is that they do make it much less likely to occur. And more practically, in my experience, they give you a good roadmap for best practices. Auditors have, I don't know that they've seen everything, but they sure seem to me like they've seen everything. And they have good ideas, good advice, and good guidelines to give you to make sure that things are going right. And I would say reviews should go beyond the analysis of financial documents and should look at your policies and procedures regarding budgeting, spending, accounting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's worth noting here that nonprofit accounting is a different animal than for-profit accounting. And so even those of us who may have spent years in the business world and know how to read balance sheets and P&Ls and all those things, we may know that world of accounting very well, but we don't necessarily know the intricacies of church accounting. It's a different beast. And there's nothing wrong with saying you don't know something, but what gets you into more trouble is what you know that isn't true, or what you think you know that doesn't work that way in the world of nonprofit accounting. So when in doubt, never be afraid to ask. And if you're not comfortable with the answer, keep asking. I regard Lynn as a sort of a guru in this area, but Gary, there are just a number of really filled, a number of really good, well-informed people in this diocese that know what's going on. Lynn's put a resource list together. My guess is that as we go over the material we'll be looking at today, all of you probably know some of this. And some of you probably know almost all of it, but I bet hardly anybody knows all of it. And that's why we need the joint wisdom of this group, not only the people that'll be presenting, but the people that are on the call that'll be listening. So there's a lot of wisdom here. Let's take advantage of it. And I would close as I open by saying that I don't know if I'd have been a better treasurer, but I sure would have slept better if I had known some of this, and if I'd known that I had these kinds of resources to go to when I subjected that poor little church in Atlanta to my role as treasurer. So that's enough of that. Thank you very much. Any questions? If not, I'll turn it back to Lynn.
Thank you so much, Jim. Yeah, I think we have a little time for some Q&A right now. Let's open up the chat box and see if anybody has any questions. Please feel free to go ahead and add something.
There's a question from Charles Murphy, it looks like.
Okay.
He says, I understand who is on a finance committee, but not sure of their role. So I don't know if Gary, you wanted to elaborate on specifically the role of members of a finance committee.
Well, the finance committee shares with the treasurer responsibility for all the financial affairs of the church. but the finance committee acts, you know, at a high level, and generally looks over things prepared by others, and also has to consider what the vestry and the rector need and want in regard to resources. And so they have to do that. And, you know, there will be an agenda for each finance committee meeting, usually prepared either by the chairperson or the treasurer. And that agenda can be fairly widespread in terms of the types of items on it. And it can vary over time as churches, a given church's financial condition or circumstances changes over time. And so there's no one thing you can say is always there or is, and it's not the responsibility of the individual member, really. It's the responsibility of the group, the whole committee, and of which each individual is part. But
Gary, I'll just add, if I may.
Yeah.
I'll pull this up on the screen during a presentation I'll be making later in the morning, but the canons of the diocese say about the finance committee that the vestry shall provide for a finance committee, and the finance committee's job includes preparing a budget for adoption by the vestry, as well as what you said, the making regular financial reports to the vestry. So we'll look at that later.
Okay. David, I think CV asked, maybe Lynn, you can answer this, or maybe you'll be talking about it later. Is a CPA audit required on a periodic basis?
Great question, David. I do get asked that quite frequently. The quick answer is no, but I'm going to go over that in more detail during my presentation.
Okay, we have Sally wants to know, what advice would you give to a brand new church plant?
I'll throw that open to the other panelists.
Yeah, I don't know if Jim might want to answer that one.
My first advice is run like the wind, but my answer, John and Gary, I think would have better detailed answers than I do. But I would say, look to the diocese. There are just really good resources here, and I think there are people that can help you when you need it. I mean, believe me, I understand. I had my own consulting company for a number of years, and I certainly understand the issue of having to be the bookkeeper, the treasurer, the accountant, and the person who makes the coffee in the morning. And now you're saying you need 5 other people to fill these other roles. But if you have to go to the diocese, if you've been planted by a mother church, go to them. Church of the Holy Spirit, where I attend now, has a pretty strong relationship with a daughter church. So I'd say don't be afraid to look outside your 4 walls for help.
I think important thing to bear in mind is that there is as much at stake for a handling finances for a church plant as for a larger church, just as there's as much at stake in protecting children in a small church as a large one. The numbers and the budget are smaller, but the need to be squeaky clean, as Jim says, is just as important. And so we want to encourage churches not to fall into the trap of thinking, well, we're only a small church, therefore we don't need to bother with, and then think of the proper procedures and controls.
Okay, so the next question is a little bit similar. Maybe Lynn can answer this one. Where does a small congregation look for an outside financial reviewer? And that's from Bob Wagner.
I have the name of a couple of people who have sensed a call from the Lord to offer their services in this way. So Bob, I can definitely provide you with some names, but another alternative would be to find a partner with another small congregation. So maybe a few people from your team would go over and do theirs, and a few people from their team would come over and do yours. That's another easy way to network and to partner with another smaller congregation. And I'd be happy to facilitate that.
As as Lynn and others are using the term outside, the people who do the annual review don't have to be outside the congregation. They just have to be outside the financial responsibility of your church. In other words, you can't have your own treasurer and bookkeeper and such review your own finances, but qualified people in your congregation who are not involved, they're not signatories, they're not the bookkeeper, they're not involved in your finances, can do it. If the church doesn't have that, then swapping with another church works really, really well.
Okay, the next question is from Charles Riffy. Taking on church debt is noted to include the treasurer, but what structure, parish, diocese, diocesan, et cetera, must be included before taking on debt?
I'm going to speak to that again when I get to the canons. The short answer is that a church has to inform the bishop, standing committee, and finance committee of the diocese if a plan to take on debt would result in annual debt service in excess of 33% of the church's average annual operating income over the past 3 years. I'll pull that canon up on the screen later on, but that's the short answer.
Okay. Patricia Hall is asking, while the treasurer ensures bills are paid, is it appropriate for them to ask the vestry that unbudgeted items are approved as to amount and source before items are expended? That'd be a Lynn. Do you know the answer to that one?
I guess I understand this question. So this would be something, an extraordinary expense that came up that was not budgeted for. And is it appropriate for the treasurer to ask the vestry to approve this? I would think yes. I mean, you certainly could take it to your finance committee first, and then take it to the vestry for their approval. Gary, I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, if it's an extraordinary item, it sort of would perhaps depend on the magnitude of it. If you're talking about a very small amount, I would just go to the bookkeeper and say, how do you handle this? And please do. But if it's a larger amount, or it's something that the church doesn't ordinarily do or is involved with, then you definitely need to take it at least to the finance committee, if not the full vestry.
Patty's PS is it's a larger amount and a tight budget. Yeah, clearly I would think vestry approval would be appropriate. In a broader sense, most churches have levels of authority given to various committees and ministries. To the children's ministry, every crayon isn't itemized in the budget, but rather supplies might be, or curriculum materials, and then trust the leaders of that ministry to operate within their budget. But that's where church size comes into play. Smaller churches tend to have a much sort of a finer review of budgetary expenditures. Large ones tend to give much more authority to ministries and committees. But larger items that are not in the budget, and there's question as to whether the budget can embrace it, really do need to be backed for authority.
The next question is just kind of a good segue, John. David Schuetz asking what constitutes a small church, and you just said smaller churches, larger churches. Is there a way to define small versus large?
No, we had a senior warden once who worked for the Senate Finance Committee, and in the middle of a discussion of a budget item, which in our quote small church unquote was $50. Without realizing it, the senior warden referred to that as 50 billion, because in his world, the first 9 zeros were omitted. And so, small and large is kind of in the eye of the beholder, I guess. So, in our diocese, churches that run, 50 to 70 on Sunday morning and below tend to be sort of seen as smaller churches. But as Lynn says, when it comes to financial reviews, there's a break point with regard to the size of the church budget that Lynn will explain a little later.
Okay, a quick shout out to Mary Beth from Alex Montalto. We have had an excellent experience with the diocese handling the bookkeeping for our church plant. Many thanks from Mary Beth. So this goes back to what I think it was talked about, is the diocese providing some of those supports. So it's going well for others. Don Foy asks, is there a list of favorable banks for the churches in the diocese to reach out to for mortgages for property acquisition?
I'm not aware of that. I think it would be a really valid question to ask other churches that have obtained mortgages in the last few years. Who's your bank, to make sure that a church seeking mortgages checks with the others that have demonstrated a willingness to loan to churches. We can help with that. If you contact us in the office, we can flag churches that have recently built buildings.
Okay, it looks like we have
Okay,
one more.
Heidi,
go ahead,
I
Lynn.
think we're running up against our
Okay,
break time. So
gotcha.
I just want to be mindful of everybody's sore eyes and backs. So
Yep, and I think we'll be talking about benevolence funds later, which is the next question. So,
So we can
Absolutely.
flag those questions.
All right.
yep, we won't forget them.
All right, everybody, welcome back. We're going to shift gears and talk some in depth about financial controls. And let me just say a word about the importance of controls. Jim Oakes talked earlier about how sensitive is the area of handling cash and how important it is for it to be done by two people and all sorts of protections. I know personally of 3 church plants that failed because the treasurer stole the church's funds and basically bankrupted the church. I know of a church where brothers always counted the offering and together stole many thousands of dollars over the years. I know of a church where the bookkeeper embezzled thousands of dollars by manipulating credit card receipts to cover personal expenditures. The treasurer of the National Episcopal Church some years ago embezzled $2.2 million over several years and was sentenced to 5 years in jail. So with that sobering introduction, let me turn it over to Phil Rooney, who has more to say to us about internal controls. Phil? You're muted, Phil.
There.
Very good.
Good morning. Before I get started, I want to show you a couple of resources that that we use in terms of publications. Here's one right there: Church Finance by Batts and Hammer. We've got one by the same company that, and it's much bigger than this one, on the tax guide. So that if you end up needing a lot of tax information, there's a big volume of that. And then there's one on church compensation too. This company associated with Christianity Today does a lot of that sort of thing. So those resources are available. And before you run out and try and buy one, check around with some other churches to see if they've got an updated one that you can borrow, because they're not cheap. But they are good. They're very good sources. Before I start on the internal control, I want to mention, based on a question about banks, do you know a good bank? Well, we just went through a construction process for our church of the Apostles, out on Lee Highway. We built a church and we borrowed money to do it, and we got a good bank. And if you want to know what that bank is, give me a call. And if you want to know some of the other things that we noticed in making this banking deal, give us a call too, because excuse me, these banking documents are about 3.5 inches thick, and you can't read them all in 6 months. And so it took us 6 months to go through and find some of the things that we are still discovering about these loan documents. So give me a call and I'll tell you a good bank. if you're ready for that. Now, internal control. If we're going to have good internal control in a church, we need the support of the leadership, and it's sort of like the second lieutenant standing up in front of the colonel that Jim talked about, and getting getting scared about having to deal with an authority. And that can happen in a church too. You know, you can get a lot of pressure to do things that maybe you ought not to do. If those pressures get so bad, then this church finance book says the next thing you should do is find another church. We're not in that shape at all, I don't think, in our diocese, although, you know, we don't know. But anyway, what are we really controlling? We're controlling money, and we're controlling property. And by controlling, we're setting up systems. And the auditors and the reviewers each year test those systems to make sure that they work. So the systems that we have can be very, very simple, like counting cash. We're controlling in the money part of that. Well, first, yeah, the money part, we're talking about cash, and we're talking about checks mostly coming in. And so we want to control that, and that's the two-man rule, which you've heard so much about. Always have two people cover cash, always. And even though in today's world we're not getting much cash, you know, we might get $10, although a couple of weeks ago we got 300, so you never know. But the point is, no matter what it is, have a system where two people count the cash. And it ought not to be the same two people all the time. So what we've done is so much of our input now, our income comes from electronic means. There's very little to count now. We used to have two counters, and they count every check and figure out how much was for the church direct, how much was for designated funds and all that. But we don't do that anymore. We just don't have to. All we need is one person to pick up the offering plate, grab someone else, and it'd be nice for it to be a different person out of the congregation. That's what we do, and count. So we count the cash, and then we count the number of checks, not necessarily the amount of the checks, just the number, and put that down, sign it, put it back in the envelope, and then we walk down to the safe and put it in the safe. So that's kind of a neat way to handle the cash in and the cash and the checks in. Always have two persons, and not always the same two persons. Cash out is getting, again, rather small. We hardly ever use our petty cash. We used to be up to 400. Now we're down to about 200. And even then, we hardly ever use it. But again, if it is used, then there has to be some documentation so that it's pumped up, or that it's recorded what you've spent that money on. As we get more into the neighborhood, we get more walk-ins. And so that's another whole issue of what you do with your money if you have people who walk in asking for $20 for gas or for a hamburger and things like that. And we have ways, but we'll talk about that some other time. Checks out, now we're talking about bookkeeping. And what we do is we have one treasurer. The treasurer signs the checks that are made, and the documentation is with the check that justified it's the receipt and the justification and the accounting documentation that we need so that this expenditure goes to the right account. So the bookkeeper in our system writes the check, puts all the documentation together, and then the treasurer signs the check. If it's more than 15,000 in our church, we have two people sign it. Again, just to control. Although having said that, don't expect the banks to check on that or to bounce a check that, you know, that says, oh, this is 16,000. and there's only one signature, I'm not going to do it. They don't do that. If they get that check, they'll process it. So this is more of an internal church control, which I think is important. I think when you have that kind of money, it should be out there for at least 2 people. So we have an assistant treasurer right now, a volunteer who would also sign. And we have other emergency signers too on the staff who would sign in case an emergency came up. And the same thing with our credit cards. We always have to have a receipt with the credit card. So when the credit card comes in every month, the bookkeeper starts collecting all the receipts. And what we do in our reports each month is if we can't find a receipt, it's put in a holding account so that we know what we're looking for down the road. We don't let that build up. We make that happen before another expenditure can happen with that check, with that credit card. And sometimes a holder of a credit card, we don't have too many, will inadvertently use it for a personal reason. So now they owe the church the money, and so we have to track that too. But we put that on our report every month where that is. The property I mentioned before is inventory, and we don't talk too much about inventory, but lately, even small churches are doing networking and doing electronics and audio visual and things like that. And that stuff is terribly expensive. And sometimes it's pilferable. Not that we have pilfering people, but it's not pilfering, it's more, oh, I forgot, it's stuff like that. So, having an inventory system is worthwhile if you've got a lot of stuff like that, and we do. So we're working that. Now the last thing in terms of cash out or checks out or payroll out is payroll, and we have a payroll service, and my advice to you is the following. If you don't have a payroll service, get one, because it makes all the difference in the world, and how much you have to know, and how much you have to track, and how much you have to be careful of that you're putting this amount of money to the Internal Revenue Service, et cetera, et cetera. Filling out 941s, W3s, all these forms, it can all be done for you cheaply. Even if you only have one person on the payroll, it's still worth it. And not only is it worth it, it's almost like indispensable now because of all these things that we talked about before in terms of payroll, especially clergy. They know these things. So many of these payroll services, and if you just hit payroll services on your Google, you're going to get 10 different companies. And you're going to get one particular place that lists all the 10 companies and rates them all. So you have lots of things to choose from. So I would do that. If you don't have it, I would do it. And one of the things that they will help you do is sort out this SICA business with the clergy. And it's not just the rector, it's if you have other clergy too. But a clergy, as far as the IRS is concerned, is a self-employed person and has to pay her own FICA. Now the FICA, normally with a normal employee, the employee pays 7.5% or something like that, 7.65. I forget what it is right now. It's around there. And then the employer pays the other half. So it's a total of about 15.5%. But for clergy, they have to pay the whole amount, the whole 15%, which is a lot of money. So what we did recently, we hadn't done that before, but now we are doing it. And again, the payroll company service set it all up so that it works out right, and the W-2s are right at the end of the year, because it's a little tricky and it's a little cumbersome. So they're good at it. What we did at our church is we increased the salary of the clergy by that 7.5%. And there was a question, I think one of you has asked about that. And that's how we handle it. We just give them the extra 7.5% as salary. Now, having given that extra salary, that means that there's more tax, that's more tax. So you can get into an infinite loop here. And we decided we're not doing that. We're just going to give them 7.5% of what we intended to give them at the beginning of the year and let it go at that. And it might cost them another $2 or $3, but it isn't worth going through the iteration in the accounting world like that. I hope I understand. I hope everybody understands that, but it's really something. Now, how do we control all this stuff from happening? Well, the way we do it is review. We review everything on a monthly basis. We review the check log and the check stubs every month. We review the bank statement and the reconciliation every month. We review the payroll reports every month. And then we give them periodic reports, the same period, some of these, to the Finance Committee and the vestry. So you could, Lynn, could you throw up the first slide there, the first exhibit? This is just the front page of a memo that I send to the vestry or to the Finance Committee showing what we report on a monthly basis. You're not going to want to do all these things because you may not have to. Like one is the equities report, number F there. We just happen to have stocks and bonds in a Schwab account. And so I price that out every month and show and give that to the Finance Committee. We have an income expense and a budget graph. We have a financial summary and then projections for 2022 and 2023 right now, because we're in that season where we're building the budget for next year. We start in September, so we're a little bit ahead of ourselves right now. And the reason we are is because we're looking to increase our staff, because we're hopefully in a growing situation. We have a new church and Nick is new on the job, Nick Braunschneider. And so we're starting to work on this right now so that we have time to look for the right people and so forth. Salary expenditures, number G, again, it's so important, but we get those numbers right off the report that our payroll service provider provides. And if there is somebody in your church who, again, insists on having a check and not a direct deposit, then these services will actually deliver that check and the reports to you free. It's all part of the deal. So again, I can't emphasize enough, if you don't have a service providing you with payroll, you ought to get it. Okay. Exhibit B, Lynn, is again a list of all the categories of pay and benefits. And I'm just throwing this up here because some of these are a list of all the things that we have looked at. Some of them we have decided not to do. Historically, we just haven't provided it, and others we've added on. But we've got all these, and of course, the two top ones are clergy sensitive with the housing allowance. Okay, and like Lynn said, the housing allowance has to be identified. How much is it going to be for the following year? And the vestry resolution has to have been resolved and logged in the book before this process starts for a year. So for example, coming up in 2022, we will provide a number for this resolution in December probably, and get them to and get the vestry to vote on it so that it's in place before the period starts. That's important. We don't provide long-term, short-term disability insurance, but these things are available. A lot of these things on this list are available through DOMA or through ACMA, right, Lynn? Yeah. Many of these, like life insurance, dental insurance, long-term and short-term disability, or if you want to shop around, you can shop. You may have other sources of insurance for that you don't want to use. So, but they are available, and some of them are very, very good. So that's the payroll and the compensation. Like I said, they'll deliver. If you have anybody who wants to have a check, they'll file all your forms for you, and they'll withdraw money automatically from your bank account. So if there's not enough money in there, you're going to hear about it really quick. But you should have enough money in the bank for them to do all these things and pay them. And then clergy SECA, we talked about that and the offsetting compensation, and we talked about the clergy allowance. Now, the last thing in terms of payroll internally is documentation. We have a personnel action form. You can go online, and if you don't have one, you should have one on any activity, financial activity that occurs, or hiring or firing or changing jobs or changing titles. Anything that involves a person on the staff or the clergy, we have a personnel action form that puts that down. We just had one pay increase here recently with a staff person, and it's so important for that everybody to see that form, sign it, and have that in your records, so that down the road, if there's any discussion, any disagreement, you've got your documentation. We've had people come in 3 years later and say, "Oh, I thought I was getting that." Well, let's go back and check. Oh no, you opted out of that, or something like that. It's so important to have that documentation. It's an internal control, and it's very, very important that you have that personnel, whatever you want to call it. And you can go online and pull this off, or 3 or 4 of them if you want. Or you can call me and I can show you what we do. Anyway, that's controlling. And now I'm going to talk about designated funds. And it's a little fun because this just happened to us. I'll tell you the story I told the other people. We just built this new church, and the neighbors wanted. We had a beautiful wall. We spent $700 million around there, and a couple of neighbors complained that because there were holes in the wall, they could see the light from the church. So they insisted that we build a fence, and the county made us do it for $15,000. Well, we just don't have $15,000. So we went to the congregation and we said, "We've got this problem, and if you'd like to designate some donations for our fence, please do." Well, we started getting them. We've had about $8,000 or $9,000 come in, when all of a sudden we got this contribution for the entire $15,000 to pay for the fence. So here I am with $7,000 or $8,000 that was already designated. And because it was designated, we felt like, we had to honor that designation. So what do? Well, there were about 9 or 10 people who had done about $6,000 worth. And I called every one of them and said, "Hey, we got the money. Can we use this some other way? Oh, by the way, we're right in the middle of constructing our new sign out there. And that's going to cost $11,000. Can we use that money for that?" And of course, everybody said yes. But you got to be careful with designated funds. When it's designated, it ought to be used for what you're taking it for. We have a lot of missionaries we support in our church. We have a lot of missionary programs, and so we take in a great deal of designated funds. One of the biggest we have is St. Nicholas Orphanage in Nairobi. And we have one particular member couple who give a great deal to supporting the orphans in that orphanage. And one time they wrote the name of the orphan that they were supporting on the check, and they got audited by the IRS, and that deduction was declined. It was turned over. They had to pay extra cash. So writing names on checks is not a good deal. Okay, never write a name on a check. If you want to specify that to that level, and we're talking about that being a gift, and that's the issue. If you you just can't use the church to funnel money in so you can collect get a tax break on it. That's not how it works. The church has to be in control of the funds. So you lose control, or the IRS thinks you lose control if you write names on the checks. So please be careful with that. But the rest of it, we honor that, and we make that an annual a treasury report monthly also. How much designated funds we started with, how much we've collected so far this year, how much we've spent so far this year, and where we are, because that is an account payable essentially. You know, in that sense, where that money is, we just can't spend it. It's specified for a purpose. And I'll just read the last thing here. Donors should be made aware that although the church will make every effort to honor their contribution designation, contributions become the property of the church, and the church has the discretion to determine how best to use all contributions. Now, if your members are aware of that, then they know that if it comes down to the worst, that the church can use that money in a different way. Now, we've never done that ever since I've been in that church. We've always honored every designated fund, and we will continue to do so. But officially, there has to be control by the church in order for that to be a tax deduction gift to the person who's giving the money. I hope that's clear. And if it isn't, we can talk about it. That's all I've got. Lynn?
Thank you so much, Phil. That's really helpful. Just to clarify, at one point, someone asked a question about writing names on checks. So you're talking about writing an actual individual's name on the check, not so-and-so orphanage or something
Right.
like that. Yeah.
Right, the actual name, right.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
All right. Is it my turn, Lynn?
It is your turn, Bishop John.
Just one PS about benefits. I have the privilege of serving on the ACNA Retirement Plan Committee, and it's a 403B retirement plan open to both clergy and lay employees, and it is superb. We've got really top drawer people, I not being one of them, who have set this up and who oversee it. We have a superb consulting firm that guides us month by month. David Powell of the Falls Church is an attorney who deals with this. As we say, David literally wrote the book on 403B plans. And I just can't, we were nominated as one of the top 3 or 4 the nonprofit 403B plans in the nation. It's grown tremendously. And one of the advantages of growth comes with it an ability to negotiate down the fees that are paid. And the fees are what really make the big difference in terms of return. So you can get information about that on the Anglican Church website under their benefits page, anglicanchurch.net. And happy to tell you more about it offline if you would like. Well, Lynn and I are going to shift now to talk about benevolence funds. There have been major changes in recent years in how these funds are understood, both in terms of a more narrowly defined purposes that are permitted, and also in terms of how these funds are properly administered. A benevolence fund is used to assist people in need and to support both individuals and organizations engaged in mission and ministry. And that's why we choose to call it now a benevolence fund and no longer use the term discretionary fund. because the term discretionary fund obviously implies that the fund may be used for any purpose that at the rector's sole discretion. And that is no longer what the IRS permits. And using that term leads to misunderstanding and even misuse by the clergy. As our diocesan benevolence policy states, it is not appropriate for the benevolence fund to be used for the rector's ministry expenses, such as books, journals, clergy clothing, or vestments, etc. A professional expenses line item should instead be established in the budget for such items. And sadly, I'm personally aware of clergy who've gotten into trouble with the IRS and with the people of their church, and ultimately removed from ministry for misusing such funds. As Lynn will explain, it is so important to set up a benevolence fund properly if you choose to have one. Some churches don't have them at all, but set it up as a fund of the church, subject to accountability and auditing, and not as a separate checking account handled only by the priest. I know old habits die hard, and some of our churches may still be operating under old principles which are no longer appropriate. If that's the case in your church, you need to push on this. Be the second lieutenant confronting the colonel or whatever you need to do. You are not calling the rector's ethics into question. You're actually protecting the rector and protecting the church from potential problems, as well as from possible criticism for how these funds are handled. So over to you, Lynn.
Thank you. So as Bishop John mentioned, the way that the IRS views benevolence funds has resulted in some important changes in the way churches should handle these accounts. So I've pulled together a few quick slides on the common pitfalls and best practices with regard to these funds. We don't want you to face any financial penalties. So here I have a brief outline of a benevolence fund that the IRS would in fact consider taxable income to your clergy person. This would be a fund that is within the total control of your clergy, a fund that can be used by the clergy person for personal expenses, as Bishop John mentioned, a fund that has no oversight from the church and is outside the regular internal controls of the church. All of that, the IRS would deem this as taxable income, and that person would be liable not only for the taxes, back taxes, but also for any penalties. DOMA strongly recommends that our churches follow the benevolence fund policy and procedures that are found on our website. A little later, Heidi will be sharing with you a page that we've put together with resources for treasurers, and there's a link to this benevolence fund policy. This policy contains best practices that are going to keep you and your clergy person out of trouble. We recommend that you hold funds in the church's bank account, not a separate bank account. We recommend that you establish an equity or designated fund as the rector or clergy person's benevolence fund. So all contributions and disbursements will go into and out of this fund. You want to disperse the funds from this account by means of your regular check request process, and these should be approved in the normal manner. Should a vestry nevertheless establish a separate checking account, here are some things you need to make sure you include. It is to be established in the church's name and not the rector's. It should be established using the church's employer ID number. The rector is one of the authorized signers, but we would recommend that at least 2 others from the church, such as the treasurer and senior warden, also be signatories on this account. To download the PDF version of our benevolence fund policy, you can go to this website on your screen. I would encourage all of you to go to the website and check it out. The policy contains a separate vestry resolution that establishes a benevolence fund account, as well as a sample vestry resolution outlining the policy and procedures for the account. So these are templates and you can customize them according to your church's needs, but we've taken a lot of work out of it for you. and I hope you'll find these resources helpful. So with that, I think we're ready to answer some questions. If we have any questions on the benevolence fund, I'd ask our panel to go ahead and unmute if you're muted right now. And Heidi, can you lead us through the chat?
Sure. We have a question. I'm not sure if it was addressed specifically from Tim W. We limit our rector to $1,000 for his benevolence fund. We're always aware of any money he gives, and money replenished must be approved by Servants' Council. However, is our Servants' Council to approve or disapprove the dispense of these funds? What about anonymity? Anonymity, I can't say.
Confidentiality.
That's a better word, yeah.
That's a really good question. And I know, Bishop, you're going to be discussing confidentiality in a later talk, but you want to address that now.
Generally, you would not have the whole Servants' Council, or otherwise known as the vestry, looking at specific named recipients of gifts of contributions or checks from the benevolence fund. Obviously, if whoever writes the check would be aware, but I can appreciate that you're having the council approve money going into the fund, but the specific checks out, I think it's appropriate to maintain confidentiality there.
If you need more clarification, let us know. Dave Shoot, I think, Shut, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right way. We want you to clarify a little bit, vacation versus a sabbatical fund. I'm not sure vacation fund is something that even exists, but Phil, I don't know if you want to answer about sabbatical funds, or that the question is, can you please briefly discuss vacation versus sabbatical funds? And John asked to clarify what a vacation fund might be.
Some churches set aside money in anticipation of the rector or assistant taking a sabbatical every however many years. And that can be a fund used for two purposes. One, it can be used to pay for supply clergy and other expenses of the church while the priest is away, that kind of usage. And sometimes churches will provide some funds to the priest to enable them to go study somewhere or do other things during their sabbatical. My assumption is that such contributions would be taxable income to the priest. Such contributions would be. That's not at all atypical. There's no set requirement of that. We don't have a policy about that. I'm not sure about vacations. Obviously, that would just be, in my view, a normal expense of the priest and family out of their income, and anything that was contributed to them would be taxable income. They're asking, Lynn, if you could put up the benevolence fund web URL again.
I'll put it in the chat box as well.
Thank you, Heidi. That would be helpful if you could do that.
You can copy and paste right from there, click right on it.
That'd probably be the best.
Yeah. All right. There's a question. Is it okay to copy offering checks?
I would think as long as you keep the copies in a secure location. I know that it's the practice of a number of churches to photocopy or even to scan those deposits, and they're helpful to have for the audit. But after your audit, I would think that you could go ahead and destroy them. Mary Beth Moore is our DOMA bookkeeper and very knowledgeable about this. Mary Beth, do you have any thoughts about copying checks? Oh. Okay, I guess maybe she's logged off. So if anybody else on the panel has any thoughts about.
I'm aware that some churches have a check reader.
Yeah.
And so that the information goes directly into their computer and into the bookkeeping system, so that the checks don't have to be manually entered into the system. So as far as I know, it's perfectly acceptable, but you're right, security is important.
Very important. Yeah.
Okay. segueing to a similar question, with internal controls and confidentiality in mind, who should have access or visibility of the giving of individual members?
I'm going to talk about that in the next hour.
Okay, I thought so. All right, hold tight.
Stay tuned. So I think now we're on to our third hour, and Bishop John is going to be talking to us a little bit about our church, our diocesan canons, and the requirements of churches with regard to finances. And Bishop John, you want to lead us through a little bit of a discussion there?
Sure thing. Thanks, Lynn. Lynn's going to pull up on the screen some excerpts from the Diocesan Constitution and Canons. This is just pulling out the things that are explicitly on point for finance committees and treasurers. Obviously, there's lots more material, and I didn't even quote the whole section, just the most pertinent parts to highlight. I mentioned earlier the canon at the top about finance committees. The vestry of each congregation shall provide for a finance committee, which shall prepare a budget for adoption by the vestry. Finance committee shall make regular financial reports to the vestry. No congregation may operate on a deficit budget without adequate reserves to cover such deficit. Pretty clear and pretty self-explanatory. The canon about a church treasurer, the highlighted, the bolding is I put on just to emphasize certain things that I wanted to mention. The treasurer is elected by the vestry and is a member of the finance committee by virtue of office, which means seat, voice, and vote. And the treasurer needs to be bonded to provide protection for everyone. The treasurer is the custodian of the funds of the congregation, shall perform such other duties as required by the vestry. Just a parenthetical word there. For those of us who were in the Episcopal Church, we were used to having constitution and canons that were extraordinarily detailed. We have constitution and canons that are actually quite minimal. And so any number of practices are left to the congregation and probably should be addressed either by resolution of the vestry or by incorporation in your church's bylaws. We don't have every detail of practice and frequency and all that detailed in our diocesan or ACNA constitution and canons. So these are pretty bare bones, if you will. The canon about audits and reviews. The vestry shall cause the accounts of its treasurer and all other custodian of funds or securities to be reviewed and reported annually in accordance with the standards to be prescribed by the finance committee of the diocese. Lynn will talk about that in detail in a few minutes. There is a canon on eligible voters in a congregation, which references the treasurer. Only those members of the congregation who are at least 16 years of age who are also recognized by the rector as regular worshipers and by the treasurer or wardens as regular contributors are eligible to vote. In fact, the phrase recognized by the treasurer or known to the treasurer is a sort of a traditional church way of referring to regular contributors, whether they are pledgers or regular contributors. So the implication there is that indeed the treasurer knows who gives. From the constitution of our church, as well, it's also repeated in the canons, all property, real and personal, owned or held by or on behalf of a congregation or mission of the diocese is and shall be owned by the congregation or mission, free of any trust or other claim in favor of the diocese or the province. A congregation or mission may not alienate or encumber its real property unless authorized by a majority vote of those who are eligible to vote and are present at its annual meeting or a special meeting called for that purpose. In the Episcopal Church, as churches tried to separate, there were obviously a number of lawsuits filed over ownership of the property, and we wanted to be abundantly clear in our context that local churches own and control their own property without claim from the diocese. However, we do want to make sure that churches don't get into difficulty inadvertently. And so the protection in this case is that you can't borrow against your property without a vote of the congregation, which also relates to the issue of obviously mortgage indebtedness that was spoken of earlier. And then the last point, which is I referenced earlier about creation of congregational debt. Congregations and missions shall inform the Bishop Standing Committee and Finance Committee of the diocese if their plans for indebtedness would result in an annual debt service payment in excess of 33% of their average annual income. We would understand that to mean operating income, as calculated over the previous 3-year period. In other words, the diocese has the opportunity to weigh in and say, we really don't think that's wise for you to borrow, be saddled with that much debt relative and debt service relative to your budget. So those are basic canonical provisions that affect churches, finances, and treasurers. So can a treasurer also be a member of the vestry? Yes. A bond for the treasurer, who can answer that for us?
We discussed that a little bit. If your treasurer is an officer of your congregation, which I'm sure they would be, then I believe your DNO, directors and officers insurance, would cover that. Also your general liability policy. So I'm not sure you need a specific fidelity bond. However, you'd probably want a fidelity bond for your bookkeeper if they're a member of staff.
I think asking questions of your insurance provider would be the place to start.
Exactly.
All right, over to you, Lynn.
Okay. All right, well, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the annual financial review and the annual congregational report. There are 2 reports due from each church every year. And let me pull these up so that you can see. Great. And sometimes there is some confusion between these 2 reports. So we'll start with the annual financial review. I'm going to briefly discuss the who, what, when, where, and why of this. And some of this information I pulled from resources written by Richard Hammer at Christianity Today. Your annual financial review, what is it? A financial review has 2 goals in mind. Number 1, to assess how your church's internal controls and processes are working. And number 2, to provide satisfaction that the information as presented in your church's financial reports is accurate. Why do we require this review annually? Well, conducting a financial review is not a symbol of distrust, as Jim Oakes mentioned earlier. It's a mark of responsibility and good stewardship. Phil Rooney also spoke about the need for good internal controls. Well, your annual financial review ensures that these controls are in place and that they're being followed consistently. Some other good reasons to do an annual review include to protect those entrusted with financial responsibility from unwarranted charges of careless or improper handling of funds, to build trust and confidence of the financial supporters in your church and the way their money is being handled, to set habits of fiscal responsibility to ensure continuity when there is turnover in personnel. And I personally think this is important because volunteers come and go, and sometimes they have varying levels of expertise. But if you have a good system in place in your church, then that can ensure continuity. To ensure that gifts made to the church with special conditions attached are consistently administered in accordance with the donor's instructions. And so that lets your donors know that their gifts are being used as intended. Who is going to do your annual financial review? Well, it's the responsibility of the church's vestry to make sure it happens, and it happens annually. The church may choose to hire an outside firm to do the audit, but others are not in a position to do this. So as an alternative, churches may conduct a financial review using audit program guidelines on our website. And there we have broken these guidelines down into the size of churches with a budget of under $250,000 and churches with a budget over $250,000. You may assemble an audit committee or team from your own church or allow an outside volunteer to perform it as long as such persons are not in any way involved in the bookkeeping of the church or in the financial transactions being reviewed. So you as a treasurer would not want to be on the audit committee. Characteristics of an audit team member. It may be tempting to go with the first person who volunteers, but that actually might not be your best choice. Although DOMA provides programs to conduct internal reviews, the person or team performing the review must be able to understand the financial data and the financial process well enough to spot any potential issues and know enough to ask the right questions. So you're looking for someone who is impartial, someone who understands accounting, and also someone who has the time. It's important to choose people who have the availability to start and finish the audit in a timely manner. Be upfront, make sure the team selected understands that the project requires significant time commitment and that there is a deadline. So what is the deadline, you ask? When is it due? Financial reviews are due to the diocese 8 months following the end of the church's fiscal year. So if your church follows the calendar year and it ends on December 31st, then we would ask you to submit a copy of your annual review to our office no later than August 31st of the following year. How do we report the results? The key benefit of an audit is the information that it yields. A report should be prepared at the end of the review to be submitted to DOMA, but key information should also be reported to your church leadership. If you have several different audiences, it may be beneficial to prepare multiple reports, each with a level of detail appropriate for your audience. So an example would be during the annual meeting of your church congregation, make a report on whether the church's financial information is correct and whether any significant issues or concerns were discovered. Then you could do a more detailed report to the vestry with specific data, information on any discrepancies, and suggestions from the audit committee or the auditor. Typically, your auditor or the audit committee will come up with maybe some additional management controls, maybe some additional separation of duties controls, suggestions. What does DOMA do with our financial reviews? I do want you to know that the financial audits and reviews that are submitted to the diocesan office are all reviewed and recorded. One of the main goals of requiring this in our canons is to make sure that each congregation is taking the responsibility to conduct this review annually as part of its stewardship. Your reports are reviewed either by me or one of our finance committee members, and occasionally we will send you feedback if we feel it might be helpful or if we see a potential area of concern. When to hire an external auditor or professional? I get asked this question a lot, but there really is no hard and fast rule about when you want to hire a CPA to conduct your audit. If your church is engaged in accounts and activities like pension liabilities, trusts, for-profit activities, schools, those activities might be too complicated for a volunteer, and you might want to consider engaging an outside accountant to audit. Other instances where you may want to consider hiring an outside auditor include getting new financing. Quite often a bank will require an outside audit in order to obtain a mortgage. Or the church might just desire increased accountability and transparency. As Jim mentioned, sometimes it's just a good idea to get a review by an outside expert. So that wraps up this portion about the annual financial reviews. The second report that's due from the congregation every year is called the annual congregational report. This report is not submitted to DOMA. This report is submitted directly to the ACNA. The ACNA Congregational Report is a snapshot of your church's operations and ministry for the previous year, and it covers 5 areas: contact information, membership, worship, stewardship, and ministry. How do we report this to the ACNA? Well, as soon as the questions become available, which is usually the first week in January every year, Heather Adams, our registrar, contacts all rectors and wardens and administrators and treasurers by email and provides them with the information that they need in order to log on to the ACNA website. The report is submitted by filling out the requested information on that website, and the website is www.acna.org. Now you can do this report all at once or over the course of several days or weeks. However, the report automatically submits on March 1st, but anytime before that, you can edit the information there. And I've pulled up an example of a screenshot. This is the first page, first few questions of the report. And as you can see, it starts by asking for contact information, congregation website, Facebook page, and then it moves on to membership and other areas. What do you do if you have problems logging on to the ACNA website? If you're having any problems with Wi-Fi or for some reason can't log on to the website, just call our office. Heather Adams, our registrar, is able and willing even to enter the report for you. So the first thing would just be to contact Heather if you have any problems. Another resource is the ACNA website itself. They have a help section with short informational videos. And if you follow this link to the quick start, they have a quick start guide, as well as a library of screencast tutorials to help guide you through the process. There's also the DOMA website as a resource for you. We have a FAQ section as well as a worksheet with some questions in PDF form. Heather has also created a few quick instructional videos for you, and you'll find them as you scroll down the page. And you'll also find a link to the ACNA reporting website on that section. So if you have any questions at all about what information is being requested or how to complete the report, I know that Heather would be more than willing to help you. That concludes my description of those 2 reports that the churches are required to submit annually. If you have any questions, please go ahead and submit them in the chat box. And Bishop John, I don't know if you want to answer those now or if you want to move on to your section on confidentiality.
Well, sure. If questions pop up about those, we'll address them. I'll just add a word of encouragement. Usually the treasurer is the one asked to complete the material in the congregational report that relates to finances, stewardship and finances, or sometimes it's the bookkeeper or whomever. But that can be done before, during, or after the time that the clergy or others are submitting other information. It can be a multitasking kind of enterprise. What we'd ask is that you and the team of your church do what you can to hop on it. Frankly, this is one of those things that people get a little task resistant about. Unnecessary procrastination, and frankly, it becomes a real burden for Heather Adams to have to make dozens and dozens of not just emails, but personal phone calls to beseech church leaders to get this done, because the data that comes in is just really vital for our whole church to know where we stand. And as we're trying to track, are we Are we making progress? Are we growing? Are we doing this? Are we reaching more people? If a report even from one church is missing, it kind of makes it very difficult for us to draw any conclusions about where we stand as a church. So please do what you can to get ahead of this at the end of the year, leading to March 1st. We'd be very grateful. All right. As questions may come in, let me shift and talk a little bit about confidentiality and pledges, giving, and a little bit about stewardship education. Question is often asked, who should know who has pledged and how much they have pledged or how much they have given. Clearly, confidentiality is important. People are very understandably concerned that their giving is not is their information and shouldn't be shared publicly with others. But it's not a matter of absolute secrecy, because contributors, of course, want someone to know what they gave so that they can get a statement of their giving for their taxes. So obviously the bookkeeper knows, and as indicated, the treasurer knows because of the information being able to attest that this person is a contributor to the church. Hence the phrase known to the treasurer is a part of somebody being considered an active member of a church, somebody who gives regularly. But then the question more often focuses on, what about the rector? Should the rector know who gives or how much they give? And sometimes people will suggest that the clergy should not know who gives what, because they might be biased in favor of large givers. I have to say, in talking and working with a lot of clergy over the years and doing a lot of stewardship teaching, in my experience, that's actually not usually a problem. But I invite you to think about the fact that if a priest might be inclined to listen more carefully to large donors in some kind of biased way, in the absence of information about their giving, that same inclination would lead them to listen more carefully simply to wealthy parishioners. But in my experience, the wealthiest members are not always the largest and most generous contributors. In fact, many times people who of very modest means are in fact the most sacrificial givers in a church. I always saw giving as an aspect of discipleship. And just like knowledge of a parishioner's prayer life or Bible reading or involvement in mission work is an important part of understanding their spiritual maturity and commitment, so knowledge of their financial stewardship gives some important insights into commitment and spiritual growth as followers of Christ. But whatever that decision is, it's important to be clear. Most parishioners believe the rector does know what they give. And so I encourage clergy that if they do not know what parishioners give, they should say that to the congregation clearly and regularly, because people will assume they know and may wonder or even be upset if no response is given to significant changes in their giving. For example, the early days of my years at All Saints, when the church was really coming alive in Christ, I had an active leader in the church who put in his annual pledge for 2 cents, which even I was attuned enough to realize was probably a message. And so I was able to go sit down and have a meaningful conversation with the guy. It was important that I talk. But you can imagine if he put that pledge in and nobody responded, it would not have helped, because he assumed that his priest knew what he was doing, what he was giving. Or the family that increased their giving 10 times over 1 year, because unknown to me at that point, the husband had given his life to Christ. And again, it invited follow-up in terms of discipleship and encouragement of their life in Christ. This has been a very important part of my life, is stewardship education. I, for a dozen years, taught the financial stewardship course at Virginia Seminary. people told me it was the only financial stewardship education course at any Anglican seminary in the world, because stewardship education is so often neglected and under addressed. And so early on in the life of our diocese, folks encouraged me to do some teaching, and we did a stewardship workshop on a Saturday. And it's the videos of that workshop that Heidi referenced and are linked on our diocesan website. The morning session was sort of biblical theology and basis for stewardship, Christian stewardship. And the afternoon sessions were about practical things about stewardship education and decisions in a local church, how to educate folks and help get folks on board with biblical commitment to tithing and a godly approach to finances. So those videos are available. Once upon a time, we had them on, on disc or something like that. I know one church that actually got about 50 copies of the DVD and gave them to everybody in the church. But it really wasn't intended for that purpose, though no harm in it. It's really more for church leaders like yourselves. So take a look at those if you'd find them helpful. One other topic on my list, and then we'll turn back to you all for more questions. This question arose about out of confidentiality is security. We tend to think of security in terms of just not leaving pledge records out on the table for everybody to look at. But in fact, we have to be more mindful of keeping things locked away, even incoming and outgoing mail. We had the experience in the diocesan office. We believe a signed check that was waiting to go out of the office downstairs was photographed, and then it was sold on the internet. And then it was used to create fraudulent checks with the signatory forged. And those fraudulent checks were presented to banks in 2 different states, not Virginia. I have an experience of another church I know well. The checks were stolen out of the mailbox for outgoing mail, and then they were cashed. The thieves were clever enough to deposit the checks without endorsing them, thereby avoiding direct evidence of fraud. And the police said they'll just say they endorsed it, they cashed it by mistake because they didn't endorse it fraudulently, they just deposited it. And he said there's really nothing we can do about it. So we now have a locking exterior mailbox for that purpose here at the church and diocesan office. So it's important to be mindful of those kinds of issues and security concerns. I'll say one of the things is we got a couple of minutes. For those who do have proper access to the information about people's giving, it can be quite instructive to do a little analysis, not by name, but you can cover names and just assign a number or something like that, to take note of how your stewardship education is going. Most churches look only at one number. What is the aggregate total of pledges this year, maybe compared to last year? But looking at one number like that only covers over all kinds of important insights. There are churches where the budget's going up, but it's being funded entirely by new members or new pledgers. And existing pledgers, when they look at it, realize existing pledgers are doing same as last year, same as last year, same as last year, same as last year, meaning that there really is no growth in discipleship. Stewardship education is not really connecting or bearing fruit. Oftentimes that leads people to realize, well, what's stewardship education? We don't talk about money. We don't talk about giving here. Because frankly, a lot of people would prefer not to hear about giving. And a lot of clergy are very reluctant to talk about giving. And looking at your education, the fruits of your education matter. On the other hand, sometimes you notice that the budget isn't increasing. Well, we got a problem. But if you look at it, you realize that, well, there were 6 families that were transferred through the military to and left. And in fact, people are in fact giving more generously. There's just a lot of things that you can discover about new pledges, continuing pledges. If you have access to the numbers, conceal the identities, but begin to look at more deeply at what the patterns of giving and education are. I would encourage you all to be encouraging your clergy to teach and preach about financial stewardship. It's a key element. When people came to John the Baptist and said, "What should we do? What should we do? What should we do?" All 3 groups that he spoke to, he responded to with information about how they handled their money. Crucial part of discipleship. And it's unquestionably, while we know stewardship is more than money, it's time, talent, and treasure. It's the treasure one that often causes people to get uncomfortable or hung up or sort of stuck in their spiritual life and growth in Christ. And sometimes one of the most helpful things that lay leaders can do is to encourage their clergy to be helping the congregation by teaching and preaching the biblical messages about tithing, about giving, about God's faithfulness to us and our stewardship of what he entrusts to us. So, Lynn, do we have some questions?
Yes, I would ask our panelists to go ahead and unmute, and let's see what we've got here. Heidi?
Let's see. No, nothing new at this point. I have a question, or I think something we talked about. I think is so interesting that maybe others know that I did not know. Phil, when you talked about getting a service for doing salaries for employees, to me that seems like a luxury item that only the bigger churches could possibly afford that. Is that true? Oh, is he paused?
Let me just respond.
Oh,
to
go
that.
ahead, Jim. Yeah.
Very quickly, to put it in perspective, I was a part owner of a consulting firm for the last 20 years, and I ran payroll through SunTrust Bank. And it seems, my memory is that it cost about $50 a month for full service. And they took the deposit, they wrote the checks, they made tax deposits, they gave me the W-2 at the end of the year, on and on and on and on and on. And that, I think I had at max maybe 3 people on payroll, frequently just me. So it was trivial. I mean, I would have spent much more than that $50 trying to do it myself, and I'm pretty confident I would have done it wrong. So to me, it's not a luxury at all. It's an essential. It's a very inexpensive essential, and it covers a lot of bases for you.
You said that was SunTrust? Someone's asking the name of the bank.
Yeah, but that's just.
Is that common?
A lot of banks provide it, but also there are payroll companies.
Oh, yeah.
Here's in the chat, somebody uses Patriot Payroll. Lynn, who do we use at the Diocese?
We use corporate payroll services, and they're excellent. They're very good with clergy payroll. That's the one caveat I would make. Be sure that they know and have experience with clergy payroll, because that's a completely different animal.
Right.
And they may assure you that they can, but it would be better if you use somebody that you know.
Why don't you put the name that the diocese uses in the chat, just so people can.
Okay.
Yeah, my comment was not an endorsement of SunTrust per se,
Right.
just that there are many, many services out there.
Sure. Okay. Bob Wagner offers a cautionary banking loan tale. I'm not sure if we want to do that now or if people want to contact you. So let's see what some questions are. Stephanie asks, when you have distinct roles in the accounting of the church's finances, do you see a need for accounts payable to have access to member giving? I see it as an internal control issue. Any advice?
I'll ask the question of Lynn and others. I don't think pledges are accounts payable. They are voluntary gifts. I don't think they rise to the level of accounts payable in an accounting sense. Is that correct, Lynn?
Well, account receivable, would it,
Yeah.
am I not understanding the question right?
Stephanie, you're welcome to unmute if you want to ask the
Yeah,
question
why don't you
specifically.
unmute?
Mhm.
Yes, you're understanding it right. I am AR, I'm accountant as well. So AR and AP do have two distinct roles, and I'm trying to help carve out some internal control functions. And this goes to the matter of who needs to see what and for what reasons. And I regard member giving as something that should be confidential depending on what your level is. And so I just want to make sure that as I make some suggestions or recommendations, that there are not times when I see that accounts payable should have access to that level within the receivables and the handling of cash.
You're talking about the detail list of,
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
the ledger. I don't think, I mean, unless it's like Bishop John mentioned, where, you know, people expect that the rector will know what they're giving or pledging. But no, I don't think in general that information is to be shared.
Yeah.
The treasurer for sure.
Yeah, so just the departmental functions. I don't see exposure to the details of member giving to be a necessary function of the accounts payable team.
No.
Thank you. Just wanted some advice. Thank you.
Yep. Good question.
Okay. Other questions? Do we want to, I'm not sure, Bob has a tale to share if it's also in the form of a question or a brief helpful thing. Do you want to unmute, Bob?
Yeah, this I belong to what was Church of the Word in Gainesville, Virginia, and we've kind of replanted ourselves as St. Thomas Anglican Church. At any rate, we have property in a building, and it's worth at least $1 million, mostly because of the land and because of recent land sales around us. We did a remodel inside the sanctuary, or the nave, the whole worship space. We did a remodel, and we spent, I don't know, maybe $90,000 or something like that. And we were going to borrow money to do this. And we went to our local bank where we have all of our deposits, and we have, we're debt free. We've been around since 2007. And so we applied for a building improvement loan of $90,000 or something like that. And the bank manager was happy to accommodate this request and sent it off to the bank corporate offices or what have you. And they went round and round. And in the end, they wouldn't lend us the money because they said they don't want to be in the position of having to foreclose on a church. So fortunately, we had enough money to pay the contractor as we went along, and we've gotten some more money collected, some offerings made that'll tide us over. But I wondered if anybody else has ever run into this, of a bank not willing to lend money based on what ought to be a sterling credit history and completely unencumbered property, because they don't want, on the off chance, to be in the position of foreclosing on a church.
Wow.
Clearly, there are many banks that do not want to loan money to churches. They'll take your deposits, but they don't want to do loans. I'm not aware of anybody trying to borrow a small amount of money like that, but it's routine for banks to say we don't lend mortgage. We don't do mortgage loans for churches for a host of reasons, and certainly including what you describe of the political fallout in the community if they were seen as the bank that foreclosed on a church. So, good question to ask up front when you begin a process, or even when you choose a bank. If you're trying to develop a relationship, long-term relationship with a bank, how do they see you?
But there are banks that will make such loans. So
Yes,
you-
Yes.
and
you
actually
need to
some
shop
community
around.
banks who kind of almost specialize in it.
Yeah.
Any chance the diocese could start collecting these names?
Well, it's a moving target. That's the problem. You really have to check, because what they were, we had a situation at All Saints where we had that relationship and all the rest, and they had a change of officers and canceled our loan days before it was to close.
Wow.
So, you just have to have an up-to-date scorecard, so to speak.
One other item that's kind of non-related at Church of the Word / St. Thomas, we don't have pledges, and we haven't had for a long. I'm relatively new, and I'm the treasurer within the last year and a half or so. They've not had pledges, and they just trust in divine providence as the offerings roll in. Do you have any thoughts on that, or are there any other congregations that operate on that basis?
There certainly are some that choose not to have pledges. I've always taken the opposite perspective, that it's so much a matter of financial accountability before God and commitment, that we make commitments with our money in everything else in our society. To imply that I will give to God sort of when I feel like it isn't to me a virtue. But I realize that some churches have just made a strategy to do that, lest they come across as we're just a church that wants your money. But I think, again, I would tend to counter that with education rather than simply taking away any kind of expression of commitment. My experience is that people who pledge give whether they're in church or not, based on their income. People who don't pledge tend to give when they're in church. And I just think that my experience is that has not been a helpful instrument. But again, would never tell a church they have to do it with pledges. But that's been my experience. People have asked, how do you build a budget without pledges? Obviously, it's based on prior experience, prior years giving, and just a sense of, trends. Are people still in the church? Have people left? In other words, you're guessing what their pledges will be, what their giving will be without benefit of pledges. It makes it's easier in a growing church context, because it's easier to kind of project growth based on experience. It's much harder to assess based on in a stable or even declining situation. It's very hard to know, especially if you have no information about what people give, and you have certain half a dozen families have left, and you have no idea what their giving was. It really makes projection very, very difficult. Other questions, anybody? Well, then let me kind of wrap us up. And Heidi, if you could kind of highlight me as I close, I'd appreciate it.
Lynn wanted to share.
Yeah.
Lynn wanted to share her resources first.
Oh, of course,
I
Lynn,
do.
thank you.
I do. So a number of people have mentioned that that document that I pulled together. So I thought I would go ahead and share that with you. This will be available on the website too. But it lists some of the books that we've mentioned today. An additional one would be, I would add Church Accounting, How-To Guide for Small and Growing Churches. That is a really nice basic church accounting book. There are several websites that I think you would find helpful. Churchlawandtax.com is wonderful. It's expensive to get a subscription there, but I've found it worth every penny. They're very on point, and they're always up with the most recent rulings. So I find that helpful. The ECFA, Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, that's a wonderful website. You can get a lot of templates from anything from an employee handbook to training. They have webinars, as does Church Law and Tax on occasion, for free or at very little cost. So those are really good websites. These are some additional resources available on our website. Bishop John has mentioned, and I've mentioned throughout the course of the day. And I think we also talked about perhaps your church's local bank possibly being a reliable source of information. I know that ours was very helpful when we were going through the whole PPP loan process, and they were a wonderful guide for that. I wanted to let you all know that we want to start providing a network for these types of questions so that we can all get together, just sort of brainstorm things as they come up. So I'm going to put together a Google group. If you want to be included in that group, would you send me an email, Lynn Milograno at anglicandoma.org? I will add you to that Google group. I will not spam you, but I will send out periodic, if there's information that's specific to treasurers or financial professionals that I think would be of interest to you. I also am interested in offering an informal quarterly gathering. So if topics of interest, whether we do it as like a Zoom lunch and we have somebody talk about, for instance, accounting software for churches. What are you guys using? What have we used? Who's using Applos? Who's using CDM Plus? Who's using QuickBooks? There's a lot of benefit we can have from learning from each other. And I think there's a lot of expertise in this group for sharing things. So send me your email address if you'd like to be included in that group.
An example of a topic, Lynn, you might want to add to that discussion is what's being asked in the comment box right now is about recurring giving. Does Diocese have a view on that? If so, what is it? I don't know if that's a stewardship teaching point or a tax law or, a financial question there.
Yeah, I don't know, Bishop John. I mean, we have a number of recurring giving donors to the diocese.
And certainly perfectly fine, perfectly appropriate. Most of our churches, I think, encourage people to set up an automatic, recurring giving, whether it's monthly or whatever basis, weekly or monthly basis. Certainly very appropriate. I would never sort of require it or tell people that they must do that. But it's certainly a very appropriate thing to do. One of the things I know some churches have considered, I'm not sure how many or any are doing it right now, because with COVID, most of our churches are not passing the offering plate. But a lot of times in the period before COVID, when people were doing automatic deduction, from their bank account to the church and giving to the church, a lot of people, traditional church folk, expressed the fact that they felt there was a lack, that they felt awkward passing the plate by. It was almost like they wanted to say, really did gave online, but not just for sort of anybody else's perspective, but just felt like, scripture says, don't come before the Lord empty-handed, meaning, you bring your offering. Well, I didn't bring my offering, even though I know I did send my offering. And some churches actually have given people, have available little cards, which have a scripture verse, appropriate scripture verse, and basically say, I'm putting this card in the plate as a sign of the offering that I have made electronically. And that I know has ministered to a lot of folks to feel like they were participating in the offering at the time. And so in any event, churches have to kind of consider what would be helpful in their context, because frankly, one thing I've learned going around the churches every week is that our churches have very different kind of cultures and ways of doing things, and what would feel right in one context would feel very, very unhelpful in another. And so it's really up to the local church to decide how best to navigate those matters and those sensitive issues.
It would be helpful during the worship service if once in a while, a few times a year or so, if the clergy, when they're starting the offering, would mention that many people do this electronically, and so they've already contributed, they wouldn't be putting it in the plate today.
Yep. Right, some good comments and suggestions in the chat for people
Mhm.
to take note of as well.
Mhm.
Well, let me close us with a story. I mentioned that I taught the financial stewardship course at Virginia Seminary for a dozen years. There were quite a number of international students that would take that course, and a number of them had English as their second or third or fourth language. I was always in awe of people who could get a master's degree in their fourth language or whatever it was. But one student, I think he was from Africa, if I'm remembering right, wrote in one of his sermons the priceless line. He said, "Since coming to America, I have learned the truth of the principle, that the biblical principle that where your treasurer is, there will your heart be also." And I have to say, that is so true, that where the treasurer is filled with faith and trusting the Lord and faithfully serving and holding the everyone rightly accountable, you're in a good place. And I'm just so thankful for all of you who serve the Lord and his church with such grace and faithfulness and perseverance. We're in your corner. We want to help. We want to encourage you. Give a shout, give a call, send an email. Let us know if there's anything that any of us can do, if we can help you connect with others who have experience similar to yours. Whatever we can do, please make it known. Don't think you're alone. We want to help. We want to support you. So my great thanks to our panel. Thanks, team, for a great morning. Appreciate all you've offered. And as people have noted, the recording of this morning will be on our website, and you and others in your church can access it anytime you want to tap into the materials that are available. So let me send us on our way in prayer. So gracious God, I thank you for our time together. Thank you for all you're doing to strengthen us in our ministries as stewards of the resources of your church. And we ask now, Lord, you would send us on our way and give us even greater wisdom and grace as we follow through in our churches with our important responsibilities. Watch over us and protect your church. In Jesus' name, amen.